Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
These guys are cool looking.
Now,
guys, the video quality, you know, the webcam quality has been super bad. And I'm looking at it right now and it seems fine, but clearly somewhere along the process of uploading the video, it goes way down, and I'm sure I messed up some setting and I've got to fix it, but hopefully I can do that before I post this, but I recognize the issue, and I'm trying to fix it, all right? The uniforms of the Household Cavalry, I think these guys look so cool, the breastplate and the helmet especially. Let's go. Brandon F., great channel. Original link to the video, top description, below that. Discord, love to have you. Let's go.
this video was originally going to be just a very basic overview of the lifeguards as a whole. We were going to talk about their uniforms, their history, as well as their modern day practices. But reading through just their uniforms alone, I realized there is a great deal of material that I didn't really want to skip over any of it. And so rather than talking about just the uniforms of the lifeguards for a very short amount of time and then largely repeating a lot of this information in the next video on the Blues and Royals, let's just combine the two in one comprehensive video on the uniforms of the Household Cavalry. Now, the most immediate way to tell these two regiments apart would be their...
Sorry, who are those other guys? So is that Nelson? That's Wellington. That's obviously Brandon F.
Now, the most immediate way to tell these two regiments apart would be their tunics. The lifeguards wearing the bright scarlet tunics and the Blues and Royals wearing a dark blue, very appropriate to their name. Oftentimes above these tunics, we will see the cavalry wearing bright polished cuirasses. Originally from about 1661 until 1730, these cuirasses were just a very dark black, and there was no ceremonial purpose to them at all. They were only really worn in the field. Between 1730 and 1820, in fact, they didn't have cuirasses at all, with the polished cuirass, which we know nowadays, being introduced in 1821, it's remained largely unchanged since that time.
Is this just to block like a sword slash to the face?
In fact, they didn't have cuirasses at all, with the polished cuirass, which we know nowadays, being introduced in 1821, it's remained largely unchanged since that time. Moving on with armor, the lifeguards have their very beautiful white-plumed helmets with the strap being held underneath the lower lip, which, yes, that does sometimes cause complications. It's important to keep in mind that these straps aren't so much intended to actually hold the helmet on the head, but rather they're planned to deflect saber blows to the face. The Blues and Royals, on the other hand, have their red-plumed helmets with the straps being held in a much more comfortable position, at least so it seems, underneath the chin. The current helmet design was introduced first in 1842 by Prince Albert to replace the old bearskin style helmets, which were used around 1830s. There have been minor changes to the plume and the spike in 1856 and 81 respectively, but otherwise the helmets are largely unchanged. Another small difference between the two regiments, the lifeguards, you might notice, have a sort of bulbous onion-shaped top to their plume rather than the Blues and Royals, which have it loosely hanging down. This originates to the practice of the second lifeguards before the amalgamation of the first and second. We'll talk more about that in the history video coming up. And it comes from the way that second lifeguards would wash, tie off, and then dry the plume while cleaning it. Some more similarities. Each regiment has their thigh-high riding jack boots made of leather, the design of which dates from 1812. Each regiment on their backs also carries a cartridge box, and these are from the days of black powder firearms, when these soldiers would be carrying carbines and pistols as well as their sabers. These boxes have remained more or less unchanged since 1856. Carrying those cartridge boxes, we have white cross belts, each with a red flask cord, which used to carry the powder flasks, again back when black powder was actually needed in the field. Now, the Blues had always worn these red cords, with the lifeguards adopting the...
Sorry, I'll be right back. I gotta do something. Okay, sorry guys.
Flask cords in 1829 were flasks, again back when black powder was actually needed in the field. Now, the Blues had always worn these red cords, with the lifeguards adopting the flask cords in 1829. At first, the first lifeguards would wear red, and second lifeguards actually wore blue red cords, but when they were amalgamated in 1922, the regiment decided to stick with the red cords. Both regiments also have their plain white pantaloons. These are for ceremonial wear. Before 1812, there was actually a variety of colors, with the Blues and Royals actually wearing red at one point for their pantaloons, although after 1812 these were standardized, with both regiments wearing the rather smart-looking pure white. Both regiments, of course, have their thick white gauntlets and carry very ornate cavalry sabers, the designs of which have, of course, varied over the years, and officers tend to have, as usual, more fancy-looking ones, but more or less the design has remained rather standard. And at the very last, for the more colorful bits of this ceremonial kit, we have during the winter months, or otherwise just general adverse weather conditions, the lifeguards wear cloaks of bright red with blue collars and facings, with the Blues and Royals wearing, as you may have guessed, dark blue tunics with red facings. Moving, I should hope, rapidly onto the uniforms of the officers, we have their the same basic color scheme for their tunics, although their collars and cuffs are much more ornate with golden designs, as well as more decorative tails. Their crossbelts and slings as well are a bit more pretentious, beautiful looking with the golden color. And of course their most clear marker would be the golden shoulder cords on their breastplates. Other than, say, a bit more shiny metals or a bit of a fancier sword and things like that, you know, normal officerial type things, their outfits are more or less similar to the uniforms of the troopers, with the same pantaloons and boots and all those sorts of things. But of course there are a number of uniforms outside of this, the most ceremonial, if you will, that they have. The first of which, we can begin with the undress uniform, which consists of a frock coat and overalls. They have small white gloves rather than the large gauntlets, Wellington riding boots rather than the much more uncomfortable looking jack boots, and a forage cap. The undress uniform is most commonly worn when inspecting troops under arms when they're in full dress. We also have the number 1 dress, which consists of a blue jacket with standing collar, Wellington boots, short white gloves, forage cap, as well as the cross belt with cartridge box. The officer's sword and shoulder cords may also be worn, and in the presence of a member of the royal family, the crossbelt and slings become gold rather than their regular white. We also have the number 2 dress, a service dress, which consists of the khaki brown jacket and tie, along with a white shirt, brown leather gloves, brown boots and trousers, as well as a brown, Sam Brown, belt. That meaning simply that the cross belt and the waist belt are one and the same unit, if you will. A sword in a steel scabbard may also be worn. Besides these 3 alternate uniforms, if you will, there are of course a number of uniforms based on climate conditions and if they're training or in combat situations.
Possibly unpopular opinion, but so just like with the same, I think the U.S. Marines uniforms look so much better than the other branches. And when it comes to the Army uniforms or you know, these guys right here, I'm not just talking about Britain. I'm talking about the U.S. too. I can see people are really admiring it, and it they're all old-fashioned looked, actually. I guess this is actually the more modern looking. It's not as cool of a color, I guess, and everything doesn't look like it fits as well. I know that could be unpopular, but
may also be worn.
It's still beautiful in its own way. It's just not as...
Besides these 3 alternate uniforms, if you will, there are, of course, a number of uniforms based on climate conditions and if they're training or in combat situations and what have you. We won't go into the detail of each and every single one of those, although you can find more information at the website linked down below. Lastly, we have the officer's mess dress, which consists of a mess jacket, waistcoat, overalls, and forage cap, with only minor variances between the 2 different regiments in cut and design, and these are really only worn during formal evening events, such as, say, dining at St. James's Palace. As for the enlisted men, the equivalent uniforms, they say number 1 dress, number 2 dress, things like that, are largely the same for the enlisted men and the non-commissioned officers, just generally less decorations, and when it comes to things like the mess dress, not used nearly as much.
You see, they also have those kind of colors I see as less appealing, but with the helmet, the saber, and the white gloves, and on the black horse, it just makes it look amazing.
Now, with that covering the basic discussion of the uniforms of the household cavalry as a whole, there are 2 much more distinct-looking uniforms which are still worthy of mentioning, these being of the farriers and the musicians of the regiments. But before we get into that, I would like to take a small aside and talk for a short bit about the horses themselves of the regiments. Now, from the earliest days of the 2 regiments, the horses were provided privately, generally by the men who would actually be riding them. And because of this, you might see a great variety of colors, of heights, and things like that on the field at any given time. We do know that by at least around 1692, the 2nd Life Guards were using specifically black horses, but again, the origins of that is very difficult to figure out exactly when or why that may have taken place. It's largely based around just paintings from the time period. The practice of individuals purchasing their own horses, though, would linger for quite some time, as even up until the Second World War, at least officers were required to actually purchase their own mounts. Nowadays, of course, all of the horses are directly purchased from the Royal Army Veterinary Corps, most of them coming from Ireland and being purchased around 3 or 4 years of age. They are selected by members of the Veterinary Corps and by the riding master, who is responsible for overseeing their training. The general requirements for the horses to be purchased are that they must be at least 16 hands tall, or about 5 foot 4 inches or thereabouts, and unbroken. The horses chosen for musicians do prove a few exceptions to this rule, but we'll cover that later. It takes about 8 to 10 months to train each horse, and about 16 weeks or so to train the rider. First, they do it in a full khaki uniform, and then in the proper ceremonial kit. Here we have a short video that I found at the Household Cavalry Museum over at Horse Guards in London about the training of the men and the horses. So I will leave you to that and talk with you again in the next, 2 minutes or so.
Civilian horses, which are nothing like these kind of animals. Some of these horses, it's one reason. It's definitely shocking. Yeah, good shot. Yeah.
We start off just on the saddle with legs hanging freely. It's to build up the muscles in the back, the legs, and what have you. And then as you get into about week 3,
Stirrups.
Which you get to put your feet into, you relax your bottoms a little bit.
The worst bit is probably going to be adapting to the saddle. Painful thing, you end up waking up the next day and not quite being able to sit down or walk or anything. Because we do.
I suspect you want to have some close-fitting underwear, that's for sure. Or trousers, as you would say.
Drill right first. Yeah, I had 2 weeks of listening to horror stories about people that had their faces chewed up by horses. So I was a little bit nervous about approaching.
What? Their faces what?
Drill right first. Yeah, I had 2 weeks of listening to horror stories about people that had their faces chewed up by horses.
Oh, jeez.
So I was a little bit nervous about approaching some of these horses.
I've gone 6 times. 5 of those was when I broke my ribs. I broke my ribs, got back on, couldn't stay on, jumped off, got back on, couldn't stay on, jumped off. So I tried to complete the lesson, which I did. I couldn't go much further.
I was nervous starting with horses because you don't know again what they could be like. The first horse that I had was absolutely ginormous, so I was quite shocked. Got well bit.
Well,
absolutely ginormous, so
someone's not afraid of getting their face bitten off.
quite shocked. Got well bit. It's my 10th week, and I was
Knock on wood.
Working as a team. It's a team environment. At night, we're all upstairs, listening to music, so you get to know each individual.
Puts you in good stead for when you go to Knightsbridge, and then you're up there with the troops as well, because you know the faces already from being here. And the same thing, you're back across to Windsor, to basically the armoured regiment, you'll kind of know faces. So everybody knows a good group of friends in the regiment.
Now, earlier on I mentioned the farriers, and while we can talk more specifically about their actual role, about what they actually do in the future, suffice to say for now, they're sort of combination blacksmith and vet, as they're responsible for shoeing the horses of the army. Now, each farrier, regardless of if they're a member of the Lifeguards or the Blues and Royals, wear the same dark blue tunics, though the farrier of the Lifeguards is always distinguishable because the plume on his helmet is actually black rather than white, with the Blues and Royals farriers getting in the standard red. Farriers are always found bringing up the rear in any significant parade of the troops, and they are most infamous for carrying these large axes rather than the traditional sabers. Historically, I should say.
Well, that guy didn't have the black plumage, and he has an axe.
Than the traditional sabers. Historically, I should say, these axes would have been used to dispatch wounded horses as well as to collect their hooves, which, again, we can talk more about why they would do that in future videos. Again, suffice to say for now, the hooves would carry information used to identify which horses had fallen in battle and such. In line with their role as the shoers of each regiment, their tunics also have very distinctive horseshoe insignias. And lastly, this brings us to the musicians, who, when compared to the troopers of either regiment, look dramatically different. This is, of course, mainly due to their brightly colored state coats. Now, these coats date back at the very latest to 1661 and have remained remarkably unchanged to this very day. Now, as you may be aware, going back to the 17th century, the relationship between Charles II and the Parliament was rather tedious at best, and while Parliament controlled the treasury, they refused to fund for the livery of the cavalry's musicians. So Charles II was actually forced to pay for the uniforms out of his own private funds, and the musicians were clad in the livery of the king. The state coats, as such, are bright golden and red colored, each one being decorated with the cipher of the current reigning monarch, currently, of course, being ER2 for Elizabeth Regina II, Queen Elizabeth II in Latin, and here you can see an old Victorian coat with a VR. I'm sure you can guess who that one's for. Other than this changing of the cipher between each generation, though, the coat has remained, again, remarkably unchanged over the past 350 years. The only real changes being to the standing...
Guys, that's so cool. I hope that doesn't get lost on you, just how you could go back centuries and centuries and it just be recognizable.
Past 350 years. The only real changes being to the standing collar and the shoulder wings. In addition to their very shiny state coats, the musicians wear jockey caps, which date much later to about the late 18th century. Their original shape was with a much larger and more rounded peak, with the modern design being introduced in 1881. Now, these lovely uniforms aside, if chance should have it that no member of royalty or the Mayor of London happens to be present for the occasion, the musicians often will revert to their non-state dress, recognizable as the standard uniforms from their original regiments. While there's not all that much to say about the instruments themselves, or at least not much that I could say about the topic, the two great big kettle drums are always a favorite. The horse which carries them must be particularly strong and well trained. Each one actually takes around 1.5 years to fully train for the job. And each drum horse is actually a hearty Clydesdale cross. I don't actually know if they're hearty, but I don't know, they look rather hearty, I assume them to be. In any case, these horses often carry very heroic names, things such as Achilles and Hector, Alexander the Great, or Jimmy. And the drums themselves are often rather ornate and usually clad in rather royal coverings. Each of those drums is actually a total of 68 pounds, and when you combine the two of those with the weight of the rider and saddle as well, it seems rather obvious why just any old horse wouldn't do, add in the fact, of course, that they have to put up with a lot more noise than the regular horses, and no, they do not get cotton stuffed in their ears. Also of note might be the trumpeters of the regiment. Their instruments as well bear the royal coat of arms, and their horses, in very stark contrast to the rest of the household cavalry, are always a very pale gray. Trumpeters, of course, were the traditional means of communication between various cavalry regiments and their commands in the field, a role which they filled really up until the last days of cavalry actually being used on the battlefield. The trumpets...
Would you want an enemy to be so quickly able to identify a messenger horse and rider?
Themselves are the last days of cavalry actually being used on the battlefield. The trumpets themselves are valveless, and because of this, they're limited in the number of notes that they can actually play. They're usually used in fanfares for the monarchy. We always see them right before the singing of the national anthem, as well as during long guards over at Horse Guards Parade. Of course, the practice of using trumpeters to hearken the arrival of nobility or royalty date far earlier than just the reign of Charles II. Well, my goodness, I certainly did manage to drone on about uniforms for a lot longer than I certainly thought I would be able to. In any case, our next video will be about the history of the Life Guards, the 1st Regiment in the Household Cavalry. If you have any specific questions about the history of the Life Guards, or about their uniforms, about how they operate nowadays, and anything like that, be sure to ask, and I'll see if I can't include it in the next section, or otherwise just answer the question in the comments below, as I always do. And until that time comes, I am and I shall remain, dear viewer, your most humble and obedient of servants.
life like. Great video as always. All right. I'd appreciate any comments, guys. I hope you're all doing well, and we'll continue learning on. All right. See you guys next time. Bye.